It's a great pleasure to be in Ireland. And I think that Ireland provides us with some figures who would be relevant for the current situation. There's a song, some of you may know it, in which the murder of James Connolly is lamented, and the next line goes, "Then God sent Larkin, a mighty man with a mighty voice." We need a mighty person with a mighty voice now to deal with the problems of the European Union. I have a forthcoming book which deals with many of the issues I'll be talking about today. It's supposed to be a mass audience book. It'll be coming out in October, called The Economics of the 1%, and there is a chapter there on the European situation. The technical version of this talk can be found in an article in the Review of Political Economy, an issue that's just about to come out, called Euro Crises and Euro Scams, Trade, Not Debt and Deficits Tells the Tale, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Europe has a dirty story, and the dirty story is that the debt and deficit crisis is a scam designed to shrink the public sector and undermine social democracy. I'm not given to understatements, but I would say that is an understatement. There is no deficit problem in anywhere except Greece. There is no debt problem, as I will demonstrate by having a look at the pigs. The problem is not deficits and not the fiscal balance. I'll go one by one. I'll begin with Greece. What was the problem in Greece? Basically, the problem in Greece was the rich didn't pay their taxes. It was a compromise reached by the Social Democrats in order to come to power, with the promise that they would go easy on the rich on the tax side if the right wing of Greece would allow a full return to democracy. In 2010, when there was a Greek crisis, the entire Greek debt was 14% of the European Central Bank assets. The intelligent thing would have been to do, or the intelligent action would have been for the European Central Bank to have its rules altered or temporarily suspended and to purchase the entire Greek debt, every bit of it. Then, if you wanted to impose upon the Greek people austerity, as was done later, it would have been much less painful, because all of a sudden, a very substantial portion of Greek government expenditure would have disappeared. And and with it, that is the interest payment on the debt, and with a relatively small debt purchase for Europe as a whole, the problem would have been over. This would have made restructuring of Greek public finances much easier. So there was a deficit problem in Greece, but it could have easily been solved. There was a debt problem. It could have easily been solved. Spain. I've frequently said that Spain is a case of no good deed goes unpunished. In 2007, 2008, Spain had one of the smallest ratios of debt to gross national product in the Eurozone. Smaller than Germany's, smaller than any other large country. Throughout the 2000s, it had run a fiscal surplus, a surplus. Not even Germany could claim that. Spanish banks speculated in the U.S. property market, and along with many U.S. banks, they went bust. The Social Democratic government bailed them out. Its deficit and its deficit, all of its deficit, and its increase in the debt were completely the result of the bailout of the banks and the lost revenue resulting from the downturn in the economy. So the Social Democratic government bailed out the banks, recapitalized them, and the banks turned around and speculated on Spanish government bonds. That's why no good deed goes unpunished. I should say as an aside, I won't have time to get into it. To make matters worse, many people compliment the head of the European Central Bank. None should compliment him more than the private banks throughout Europe. Because instead of insisting upon a change in the rules so that the European Central Bank could purchase directly government bonds, instead of insisting on that early on, did a roundabout route by extending credit to private banks to purchase those bonds. Now reflect upon that for a moment. Large banks all over Europe were receiving money from the European Central Bank at about 1% in order to purchase bonds that were getting up to 7, 8, 9, 10%. You will never be unpopular with bankers if you lend them money at 1% so that they can buy bonds at 7, 8, 9%. Okay, so the Spanish debt was a result of the reckless actions of Spanish banks and the so-called fiscal crisis of Spain is in fact not a fiscal crisis at all. It is a private bank crisis in which there was a nationalization of bank debts. Italy. Italy in some ways is, you might say, the dirtiest story of all. First of all, like in Greece, you got a government that wasn't elected. No Italian ever went to the poll to vote, to cast a vote whose result might be to make Monti Prime Minister of Italy. On the contrary, when he put himself before the electorate to do that, he was roundly routed. In the 1990s, the Italian government dedicated itself to getting into the euro. In order to do that, it had to maintain the stability of the lira, and in order to do that, it had to build up reserves. And the way it did that was to borrow from commercial banks, and the borrowing went as high in, I believe it was 1992, as 9.5%, but from 1992 through 1996, it averaged about 7.5%. And it wasn't until 1999 that the interest rate on Italian bonds dropped below 6%. So in 2011 and 2012, when the borrowing rate on Italian bonds went to 5-6%, it was no higher than it had been 10 years before. And the Italian debt in 2011 was 111%, I think, of GNP, exactly what it had been 20 years before. And the deflated value of the Italian debt in 2012 was slightly less, that is, adjusted for inflation, was slightly less than it had been in 1990, and slightly less than it had been in 2000, and slightly less than it had been in 2005. Berlusconi, a congenital liar, said when he was being thrown out and replaced by Monti, there is no Italian fiscal crisis. He told the truth. Perhaps the first time in his life, but it was the truth. Portugal. The Portuguese story is very much the same as the Italian story with regard to the public debt, with the difference that until the crisis came, it did not differ that much from Germany's debt. Portugal was not a heavily indebted country before the international financial crisis. It became heavily indebted because with the crisis, the economy began to decline and revenue declined. Deficit increased. Then when austerity was introduced, of course, GNP started to contract. And it is unnecessary to be a mathematician to realize that if you have a ratio, debt to GNP, and GNP contracts, the ratio is going to go up. Now, I gave a somewhat similar talk about 6 months ago, and at the end of it, someone from the audience raised and said, "Why haven't you talked about Ireland?" And I'm going to remedy that now. Earlier this year, I went to a meeting at an event, I should say, at the German embassy in London, where a very high official of the Social Democratic Party of Germany spoke. In fact, he is a person that is identified as, should the Social Democrats win the election, that he would become the chancellor. And in the course of that discussion, someone asked him a question, and in the course of the answer to that question, he said, "Ireland is the star pupil of austerity. It shows the way to other countries." Okay, well, let's have a look at the star pupil. This is why they think Ireland's a star pupil. The very heavy line shows the fiscal balance of Ireland, deteriorating very sharply 2010, and suddenly it shoots back up. That's what's called a V-shaped recovery. And the lighter solid line shows a GDP growth, which goes from negative to positive, and export growth goes strongly positive. So this is what everybody else should try to do. Congratulations, you're coming out of the recession. The real story is impoverishment through exports. I have another diagram, just a little hard to read. What this shows is the very heavy solid line shows net per capita income in Ireland. And it's measured on the right-hand side in thousands of US dollars. Household income in Ireland has gone down and continued to go down slightly as Ireland's GDP has risen. Why? Because you can proudly say that I think, I haven't checked every country, but you probably have the largest trade surplus as a share of GNP of any country in the world. Now, what does that mean when you're running a trade surplus of over 20%? The only way you can do that is by forcing down domestic income. You have all of these, normally what you think of the purpose of trade, you export things in order to import things, but not in Ireland. And I might add, not in Latvia either, the other great star pupil. And the dashed line shows the unemployment rate. So during this recovery, you've had rising unemployment, falling household income. If this is a recovery, then I would shudder to think of what a recession would look like. Though we do know Greece is what it looks like. Just to emphasize what's going on, here, horizontal axis measures domestic per capita income in Ireland. Vertical axis measures exports per capita, and it's a negative relationship. The more you export, the less is left for the domestic population to consume and invest. We have a word for this. There's a word, it's called mercantilism. It's what Adam Smith criticized over 200 years ago. Mercantilism is exporting for the purpose of running a trade surplus. So Ireland may be the star pupil, but I think you need a different school, and certainly different teachers. Okay. So what is the problem? The problem is that German economic policy is destroying the European Union. Several people have alluded, Malcolm and others, to Germans freezing real wages. You know, there is a certain irony, more than a certain irony. There's an irony and a hypocrisy when German policymakers and people in the European Commission say the problem in Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal was wages were too high and they need to force them down. Germany, outside of Scandinavia, has the highest wages in Europe. Even with wage restraint, it has much higher wages than in the southern European countries. The problem is not wage levels. The problem is not even productivity. I haven't brought the statistics for that, but they're in that article I referred to. Problem is one, which has been mentioned, Germany, the German government, the Social Democratic government, at the end of the 1990s, entering into an agreement with the trade unions to freeze wages. That was one thing. The second thing was a restructuring of the tax laws such that conversion of the payroll taxes to VAT. Payroll taxes things like workers' contributions and employers' contributions to unemployment compensation and pensions. There was a conversion of those taxes to VAT. And then if you exported, You didn't have to pay VAT. Also, we have a word for that that's called an export subsidy. So the German government, for the last 13, 14 years, has been freezing real wages and subsidizing exports. It is, I hesitate on this one, but I'll forge on. The last 150 years in Europe, what has been the political history of the last 150 years in Europe? Not quite so relevant to Ireland because it stayed out of the Second World War, but what has been since the Franco-Prussian War? The politics, the organization of Europe has been around preventing German domination of the European continent. Having seen off France in the first half of the 19th century, it became a question of Germany. The European Union was supposed to bring that about. De Gaulle famously said, "I am not anti-German, I want three Germanys, East, West, and Austria." It appears that the European Union has become the vehicle for the domination of the European continent. Not because there's anything wrong with the Germans. Any economic union which has one overwhelmingly dominant member will discover that that overwhelmingly dominant member will sooner or later begin to pursue its own interests. And that's why the United States dominates the North American Free Trade Association, and that's why the Germans dominate the European Union. And I'll show this in a more graphic way. On the left-hand side, the graph that shows the trade balances of, first of Germany, that's the one going up, and of the 5 pigs. Ireland is the only one with a trade surplus. All the others have a deficit. And if it's not obvious from that diagram, the relationship between the two, look on the right, which measures the trade balance of the pigs going to the left and of Germany vertically, one rising, one falling. And the interesting thing is, down in 1999, 2001, 2003, everybody was about balanced. Germany had a small deficit. Some other countries had small surpluses. And now it's quite a different story. Okay, this leads to certain basic truths about the debt and deficits that the Troika never tells us. The first point is that deficits are the solution to the recession. They are not the problem. What I mean by that is, let's begin a situation as it was in the early 2000s. Most countries have relatively low employment. They're growing, as Malcolm pointed out, slowly, some of them, but they are growing. And you come to a downturn. What happens in the downturn? Unemployment rises, output falls, and there are some automatic adjustments that soften that. They're called automatic stabilizers. And among these, one is payment of unemployment compensation. So people lose their jobs. They can't they don't have money to spend. Output goes down further. This is the multiplier process. But that's softened by the payment of unemployment compensation. And then older workers lose their jobs, and some of them retire early. And so retirement payments go up, pension payments go up. This is going to increase the deficit. And you ought to be glad it does, because it is what is softening the decline. Fiscal deficits increase as a result of downturns, and they decline due to growth. You can't eliminate a deficit by cutting expenditure. I mean, if we've learned anything in the last 3 years, surely we must have learned that. Because what happens? You cut expenditure, it has a multiplier effect on output. Output goes down. The deficit may decline slightly in absolute terms, but it will not decline relatively in terms of GDP. The best example, perhaps, is Britain. Despite all the claims, false claims, by the current British government, the absolute size of the British deficit, fiscal deficit, now is the same as it was when Gordon Brown was defeated in May of 2010. Okay, public debt. How do you get public debt down? Again, we should know this one. 1945, the United States had a public debt that was 250% of GNP. 250% of GNP. Things like that happen when you have a war. By the mid-1950s, it was down below 100%. They didn't pay any of it off. It was no larger. In fact, it was slightly, it was no smaller. In fact, it was slightly larger. GNP had grown. GNP had grown at a consistent rate of 3 to 4%. Compound interest has an amazing effect. You go at 3 or 4%, 5% a year, and your debt to GDP ratio shrinks magically. The fourth thing, this is on Ireland and Latvia being such great examples, even if we were prepared, the Irish people and the Latvians were prepared to accept a declining domestic income, generalizing that model wouldn't be possible. These are two small countries. Are France, Spain, Italy, all at the same time going to move from a trade deficit to a trade surplus? While Germany maintains its trade surplus? To whom are those countries going to export? Well, the Chinese do seem to have a rather healthy appetite for imports, but I think not even the Chinese economy could solve that problem. So you aren't going to get a broad-based recovery through exports. So where are we left? We're left with a European Union which increasingly is governed by arbitrary rules that are largely beyond democratic control. The Fiscal Pact. Ireland is one of the countries that has ratified the Fiscal Pact. That's a quotation from it. The implication of this statement is that the European Commission has the option of vetoing national budgets. Now, I may be old-fashioned, but I grew up taught that in a democratic society is a society in which citizens decide what their elected representatives will. Well, citizens elect representatives, and their elected representatives make decisions, and those decisions may be foolish or they may be wise, but you have to live with that, and if you think they're foolish, then you defeat them. We have a new definition in the European Union. People elect their representatives. Representatives make the decisions, and then the European Commission decides whether or not those decisions on budgets are acceptable. The fiscal compact effectively terminates that democratic, or severely amends that democratic principle that citizens determine the policies of their government. Plus, with a common currency, elected national officials exercise no influence over exchange rate policy. The European Central Bank determines EU monetary policy with no effective influence by elected representatives. From the ECB website, we read the following, and you should notice that it says the ECB has the obligation to explain and to justify its actions. I would not call that accountability. Accountability is when there is some mechanism by which an organization or person can be forced to alter their decisions. Explaining and justifying is not sufficient. I would say that the fiscal pact de facto enforces a passive and neutral fiscal policy throughout the Eurozone, and that the citizens of Europe have very little, well, in the Eurozone, have very little influence over the decisions that are taken in the central bank or in the European Commission. It is true, there is a European Parliament, but I think we should know by now that its powers are limited. I think what we have is, you might say, a simulation of democratic participation through the European Parliament, severely limited by fiscal and monetary rules, and the major decisions of economic policy made in an ad hoc manner by the Council of the European Council. I mean, all the bailout mechanism, whether it's Greece or Italy or Spain, those derive from agreements largely reached in a non-transparent way by heads of state or their representatives. I might just say as an aside, I'll come back to this, that within this authoritarianism, you can't even claim technical competence. The fiscal rules are have no analytical basis. The debt rule of 60% is based upon something called the gross debt, while in the United States and in Britain, the relevant measure is taken as the net debt. The net debt is the gross liabilities of the public sector minus its foreign exchange holdings and its other liquid assets. And in case you think that this doesn't make much difference, now, in the case of Spain, for example, it has a gross debt of about 80% of GNP, and its net debt is almost within my strict criteria. It's at about 64%. The IMF uses the net debt as a measure of, for its programs. It is the wrong measure. And equally wrong is the deficit rule. The deficit rule being used is what's called the overall deficit. And if you go on to the web and you go to the IMF and you type in guidelines for deficit reduction, you will see that the IMF says that you ought to use something called a primary deficit. The primary deficit is a gross deficit minus interest payments, and that's what the IMF uses for all of its programs, but not the European Union. The Treaty of Rome, I think, was a heroic effort, a historic move. It was going, while it's obvious from action, I was born in the United States. I've been living in Britain for over 25 years. I consider myself a European. We Europeans, I think we can forgive not the Irish, but have an alarming history of fighting among ourselves for, hundreds of years. The Treaty of Rome was going to bring that to an end. It largely did do that. However, what it didn't do is it didn't bring economic peace to Europe. And we've seen the way in which it has become necessary to enforce austerity in some countries. And I would close by saying competitiveness, improving competitiveness, should not be the goal of any country in the European Union. What the goal of the members of the European Union should be is cooperation. Competition leads to conflict. Competition, aspects of it, are a positive thing in an economy. But competition, national struggles to improve competitiveness, to raise your trade at the expense of somebody else, is a prospect for conflict and disaster. And that's what got us here. And let us hope that it doesn't imply that the European Union has run its course. Thank you.
Just to put to you, Professor, you comment on the fact that the United States is, a dominant economic force in Northern America. Admittedly, I think everybody's confidence in the EU institutions is shaken. There's a lot of stuff to be sorted out. It's a wake-up call for all of us as individuals. But I put it to you that the United States is not at war. And I put it to you that, Europe at the moment is not at war with itself. And that's the deal. That was the original deal, to keep the French and the Germans away from each other from a war point of view. And it's still a good deal. I just put that to you.
I'd like to put the question to Professor Weeks that he put to the Minister this morning, namely, what is possible for Ireland to do if Germany maintains their current stance? I mean, I agree with the analysis about the mercantilist export route for Ireland, but if there is no change at the federal level, is there really an alternative path for Ireland?
My name is Anne-Marie McGarn from NESC, and I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm just thinking about the idea that debt and deficit crisis is a scam designed to shrink the public sector and undermine social democracy. And obviously this is happening in the PIGS countries and possibly in the UK. But like, what about the rest of Europe? Like, are they just interested in reducing public sector and undermining social democracy in the periphery countries?
First question, you're quite right. I think a military conflict within Western Europe is inconceivable, and that is a tremendous step forward. Because to a certain extent that was maintained through an unfortunate arrangement called the Cold War for a long time, and we needed something else to do it to maintain that afterwards, because we Europeans do have an alarming tendency to pick up arms and have a go at each other. So I think you're right. However, economic conflict is also very serious, and we need to try to avoid economic warfare. And I'll say in a moment how to do it when I talk about alternative for Ireland. Is there an alternative for Ireland? I think we have to think outside the cliche, as they say. I think in the next couple of years, at least two countries are going to drop out of the euro. Cyprus and Greece. Okay. And it's going to be very messy. They aren't going to do it because they want to. They're going to do it because they're forced to do it. Okay, so I think if possible, countries should act before they're forced to do it. And I think that the IMF's admission of its mistakes is because the leadership of the IMF thinks things are going to go very badly in not too distant future. And the IMF, Christine Lagarde, wants to be able to say, while it's partly our fault, we realized it and we drew back. I think that they sincerely mean it, but I also think it would not be done, I think, unless there was some motivating political factor, and I think the motivating political factor is the anticipation that things are going to go badly. Okay, where's that? How does that lead into Ireland? I think there are several things that could be done. If you thought that some of Malcolm's suggestions were unrealistic, well, I'll now take you into Never Never Land. But you never know, right? You never know what's going to happen. Apartheid was overthrown, and okay. What I would do is that I would nationalize the banks. You might make them cooperatives, or you might mutualize them. They don't actually have to be owned by the government. Then I would use those banks for the government to borrow money in order to run a deficit. I would use that deficit to stimulate the economy. I would use the money to on training and improving infrastructure and a whole lot of things that would make Ireland more competitive, because unfortunately, and no use trying to cooperate with a bunch of people who won't cooperate with you. You have a large trade surplus, so you aren't going to, that's not going to be a barrier for a while. then once Ireland begins growing on a sounder basis, I think you'll get an inflow of foreign investment, and you'll be seen as a success, a real success. So I would say that is, you might say, the unrealistic alternative for Ireland. Other than that, a more minor alternative, forgive me for going on too long, would be to several people, particularly in discussion industrial policy, said we have to get out of this low tax regime. We need to get into a regime in which you're fostering Irish companies and fostering productive companies. Go to the European Union and say, we can't do it by ourselves, but if we can get an agreement on taxes, we'll give up our low taxes tomorrow. All we have to have is one major country to do it, and we'll do it, and we'll have a new policy in Europe. Just like the British should go along and say, we can't get rid of the city of London on our own, but let's get a European-wide agreement, and then we'll be able to do it. So that would begin to be a step in the right direction. Social democracy. Definitely Britain. I think the biggest resistors are France, the Nordic countries. There are being cutbacks in social provision in the Nordic countries, but these have been going on for a while. I don't think that they can be particularly attributed to austerity, but that is definitely the case in Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Smaller countries, Slovenia. Slovenia, one of the last countries with a major state enterprise sector. That's the crisis being used as an excuse to get rid of that. So, yeah, I would think except for a few countries, that is general.
And Tom O'Connor, it's not actually so much a question, it's a criticism. A criticism, and that is that, and it's something that's gone throughout the conference, and that is that your analysis tends to be in terms of countries, and you say, you know, Germany is doing this, France is doing that, Greece is doing the other. But equally, you also pointed out that the German government has restrained wages. You know, so probably the vast majority of the German population are not benefiting. And into the bargain, you know, you pointed out correctly that Germany is running very large current account surplus. So there's a lot of money coming into Germany. A lot of the analysis earlier on was, where did that money go to? Some of it was speculation in Irish property and Spanish property and so on and so forth. Now it's part of what caused the problem. But the word we don't use here, and is never used in social democratic meetings, which I think this is the word class. I mean, this is really a capitalist class using its government acting on behalf of the capitalist class and not acting on behalf of the working class. And I think you're probably right in saying that there's a scam to downgrade social welfare, to implement and push through neoliberal policies and so on and so forth. But for some reason we don't use that term, you know. And we talk about Germany under Eisenhower. It's the German capitalist class that's under Eisenhower, which a lot of the capitalist class in other countries is not worried about because they are in cahoots with them. They're only too delighted to push down their own working class. They're only too delighted to push down public sector in Ireland, in Britain, in France, and elsewhere. You know. So I think we just don't use the word class, and I think if we did, we probably would get a better analysis.
Here.
Ask Professor Weeks, does he see any difficulties on the horizon by extending the euro to Eastern Europe?
Simon Toots from St. Patrick. Given the bigger budget deficit would be a good thing right now, would it be a good idea for Ireland to leave the euro so that we could have a bigger deficit and finance it ourselves?
Okay. Thank you. First on class, you're absolutely right. And in this book, did a shameless advertisement for a long discussion of inflation, I say. It's a class act. You know. Inflation is all about class, really. And you're right. And deficits are all about class. And a friend of mine, an acquaintance with some people here, I think Heiner Flashback, a very well-known German economist, has said that not even all the German capitalists are united in this policy. It's the big companies that export that are making a lot of profit from this. And so I think you're right. In each country, the capitalists face a historic opportunity. You know, this in Britain, it's absolutely clear that they see it. My son works for the largest British trade union, Unite. It's clear that they see it. They have a historic opportunity to finish the crushing of the working class movement and fundamentally downsize the public sector. And I think that they're prepared to put up with a lot of recession in order to do it, because they think they will never get this opportunity again. So you're absolutely right. Euro to Eastern Europe. I find it incomprehensible, actually, that even the Latvian government, as reactionary as it may be, would seriously be considering joining the euro at this stage. Particularly when you could have the same benefits by fixing the exchange rate, tying your exchange rate to the euro, and at least waiting it out a year or two. So I think I would, and I'm not the only one. I think even there much more, mainstream writers are saying that no one should. You should wait. No, that's right. I think it would be a bad idea. And I'm sorry, I did make a note on your question. What should Ireland? Should they drop on? Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yes. I think you could have a transitional phase in which you have parallel currency. You got a large. Ireland is probably best placed to make the transition out of the euro because of the large trade surplus. So if you were establish a parallel currency, declare a debt moratorium, which is not so unusual. I mean, it's happened many, many times. Not only in Latin America, it's happened in Europe too. It's happened in states of the United States. And so I think that it would be painful, but probably no greater than the pain that you're going through now.
Look, I'm struck by the fact that, we have elections. People voted for these public representatives. The public representatives that persuaded us to vote for the Fiscal Compact. Now, I don't know whether the orthodoxy from both the right and the left was that we should vote yes. And I don't know whether it is that the elected representatives didn't understand what was meant by the structural reforms required by the Fiscal Compact. But everyone today seems to be ignoring the fact that we did have elections. And who are the policymakers if it's not the elected representatives?
Well, I think you're right, and that's the problem, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, how do we explain this? I mean, if I'm right, and other people who have spoken are right about austerity being such a dysfunctional policy, why does it go on? Why do people vote for it? Well, I think it goes back to this gentleman's mentioning in class. The trade unions throughout Europe are much weaker than they were 20 years ago. When they were strong, there was a certain ideological balance that in which principles of things like full employment and a more equitable distribution of income were considered to be quite important. With the development of the neoliberal ideology, I think a number of things have happened. One is, if you think about it, we have had a breakdown of society almost, our concept of society. Maybe not here, but certainly in Britain. I mean, now, you never talk about citizens anymore. You talk about customers and taxpayers, as if that were a bad thing, as if it were a burden to be a taxpayer. You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of you heard of him, he was head of the U.S. Supreme Court for countless years. He said, taxes are the price we pay for civilization. Well, that's right, isn't it? And so it seems to me one reason that we're able to be convinced to vote for these people is because we've been taught that it's each of us for ourselves, and that the government is just like a family, and it can't run into debts, and it has to balance its budget and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's ideological. I think it's ideological because the counterbalance is extremely weak, namely the trade union movement. But that's a very important question, and thank you for asking it.
Now, we're running up to 5 o'clock, so I'd like you to express your appreciation for Professor